Welcome everyone to our second debate of term and our final debate of the open period. So if you're enjoying the show so far, make sure you join to come next week. The motion before the House tonight is this House would nationalise the grid. With Russia squeezing Europe's gas supplies, the price of energy is pushing record new highs. Has the industry failed in its obligations to the public? And is nationalisation really the silver bullet some would have it to be? Well, that's what we're here to decide tonight. Before we start, if you notice, our Freshers discount ends tonight. If you join before tonight, you might just get a ticket to the Freshers Ball, so let that convince you. Secondly, I see a lot of new faces in the room, so I want to do a quick introduction to how to debate. We very loosely in this chamber follow the British parliamentary format. So a motion is put before the House, and we divide ourselves either in proposition or opposition of the motion. Each of our wonderful paper speakers will speak for 10 minutes. If you want to get involved in the debate, though, there's many ways to. I'm going to go through two. First, stand up at any time and say on that point or point of information. The speaker doesn't have to take you, and they won't take you in their protected time, their first and last minute. But if they're so inclined to, have encouraged them to, you can then make your point, argue with them, sort of shout across the chamber, whatever you want to do. If you're not up for that, we also have floor speeches. So after every pair of prop and op speeches, we'll move to a round of floor speeches. If you've got a strong reason why you should vote for or against the motion, please stand up and give your floor speech. It's a great way to get involved, it re-enhances the debate, and it makes them sort of move much more entertainingly, so I encourage you to do that. Without further ado, I will move to the first speaker, the wonderful Kat Hobbs. Kat is the founder and director of We Own It, a national organisation campaigning to bring public services into public ownership. She has previously been involved with the Campaign for Better Transport, where she lobbied internationally on behalf of bus and train passengers. Kat, you have the ears of the House.
Thank you. What did I just say here? Thank you very much. It's an absolute honour to be here tonight and opening this debate on whether we should nationalise the grid, or rather bring energy into public ownership. So I'm the director of We Own It. We campaign for public services for people, not profit. And I'm going to talk briefly about public ownership in general and then about energy in particular. What we've seen in the last 40 years with Thatcher's experiment of selling off our water, our railway, our buses, our energy, is that this extreme ideological experiment of privatisation, this idea that the private sector has to do absolutely everything, this proposition of privatising the world that was put forward in the 1980s by John Redwood and Oliver Dowden in their book of that name, has failed. Our costs have gone up, the quality of our services has gone down, and we've lost accountability over our public services and our assets that we pay for, that we rely on. Our rivers and seas are filled with sewage by privatised water companies that have us over a barrel because we have no choice but to use them. Our fragmented privatised railway is mostly run by state-owned companies from other countries which return a profit back to passengers there. Fair enough, but how does that make sense? While middlemen profit up to £1 billion a year from owning and leasing out trains. And instead of copying countries like France, which has used its publicly owned EDF to keep bill rises at 4%, or countries like Norway, which is paying 80% of people's bills above a capped price in this crisis, the UK insists on propping up the profits of private companies while people struggle to heat their badly insulated homes and we move far too slowly to renewable energy. Now, this is Cambridge, so I'm sure you need some definitions. We define public services fairly loosely as things that are about providing our basic needs to live a good life in society, things we need some democratic accountability over, and they are generally natural monopolies. It doesn't make sense to try to pretend there's a market, to try to pretend that there's competition. So we're not arguing that you should nationalise food or corner shops or hairdressers. This isn't about North Korea or communist Russia. This is about a mixed economy to deliver a range of things that humans need in the most appropriate way. This is also about acknowledging that not everything can be bought and sold, and that economic textbooks don't always reflect reality. Strong public services support a strong economy. They enable us to participate, things like schools and hospitals. They fill in gaps where the market isn't providing or where the market is dysfunctional. And public ownership is a tool that we can use to deliver on public goals, goals like affordable energy bills, and tackling climate crisis. Public ownership means that we can reinvest profits, and it gives us a say over the services that we pay for. Public ownership is not a panacea. We have to get it right. We have to make sure that we have the right management structures in place, the incentives, the accountability mechanisms. But we already have examples of this in the UK and abroad. For example, here in the UK, we have Scottish Water, we have Channel 4, we have Ordnance Survey and the Met Office and the Royal Mint, probably the oldest publicly owned organisation in the world. These organisations return a profit to the public purse, and they provide a great service. Now to energy. Energy isn't just one thing. This is something that people can get confused about. So what we want is a proper windfall tax. We want to set up a new publicly owned renewable generation company. We need to bring the national grid, which transmits electricity and gas across the country, back into public ownership, buy it back. We need to buy back the regional distribution companies, which take energy to our homes and businesses. And we need to set up a supply company in the retail market. Not very catchy. So I'm going to take those demands one by one. The windfall tax, for every £8 that we collect in tax on barrels of oil in the North Sea, Norway collects £100. So they've got a 1.4 trillion sovereign wealth fund that they're using to reduce people's bills in this crisis. We could do that kind of thing. Second demand, creating a new publicly... Yes? Very good point of clarification. We need a permanent windfall tax, essentially. A permanent tax, a higher level of taxation. Appreciate the clarification. Second point, we need a new publicly owned renewable energy company to generate energy from our wind and water. So if you look at the green leaders of the world, we are in the top 10. We are the only one that doesn't have a state-owned renewable energy company. So Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Switzerland, Austria, Finland, New Zealand, France, and Iceland all have a state-owned renewable energy company. And if we had one of these in the UK, we would have profits coming back to us, we could create jobs in this country, and we would be boosting our economy. We could make the most of our natural resources and coastline, instead of allowing publicly owned companies from Denmark and Norway and the private sector to do that. And the evidence shows that when you have a company like this, that increases private investment in renewables as well, because the public sector takes more risk and drives it forward. So thanks partly to pressure that we've put on them, Keir Starmer has now committed to to set up Great British Energy, a new publicly owned renewable energy company, in the first year of a Labour government. So third point, we need to, the title of this debate, nationalise the grid. That means transmission and distribution. Those things are a natural monopoly. They should all be in public ownership. Almost every other country in Europe has their grid almost entirely in public ownership. Instead of profits flowing out to shareholders, we could upgrade the infrastructure and speed up connections to community renewable projects. Public ownership of the grid would save us around £3.7 billion a year. That's money that wouldn't be going to shareholder dividends, and that's money that we would save on the lower cost of borrowing. It's a good investment. Public ownership of our grid would be paid for in around 7 years on that basis. Right now, our grid is 98% owned by investors from around the world. So right here in Cambridge, your electricity is brought to you by UK power networks. The name is misleading because it's owned by a Hong Kong billionaire, Li Ka-shing, who's made a profit of nearly £500 million in the last 2 years. And so that makes absolutely no sense. During Corbyn's leadership, Labour was given a really hard time for its policy of buying back assets. But actually, it's not that difficult. Under this Conservative government, they are bringing a bit of the national grid back into public ownership. They're calling it the Future System Operator. They need it to plan for net zero. They also need it because of conflicts of interest within the national grid. Yes.
Maybe you've said it, but I just want to know what your thoughts are. I'm on your side of the debate, but the grid is separate from the energy suppliers. So what if
Yes.
the energy suppliers are still, they're saying we won't give you any oil if you try and sell it for this cheap price. How would you tackle with that if you've just got a nationalised grid, but the actual supply is privatised?
So the two things are separate things. So we need to deal with them separately. So the national grid and then the companies which own the regional distribution, they're not actually generating the energy. They're a separate part of the system. Thanks for that point. So final point, we need to set up. Oh, 1 minute. We need to set up a publicly owned supply company. Professor Hall will talk more about this. It's normal in France, Italy, Germany, and the US. There's a really easy way to do that right now by keeping Bulb in public ownership. It's collapsed in private hands. It's got 1.6 million customers. That's a perfect customer base to work and operate in the market at scale. It could also deliver a program of mass insulation, and it could be potentially connected up to renewable generation and part of that, instead of the government spending £2.2 billion of our public money on bailing it out and getting Octopus to buy this private company. That's a missed opportunity. Right now, we've got public subsidy propping up a failed privatised system. What we need to do is, if we're pouring in public money, we need to get public assets back out of it. By 2030, we could have all renewable energy generated locally and nationally, travelling across a publicly owned grid that's getting quickly upgraded, and we could be paying our bills to the supply arm of Great British Energy, which has insulated our homes. That's a way to tackle the climate crisis and the cost of living crisis. We need fair bills, we need warm homes, green energy, and we need energy not to be something that people have to worry about, except that they can be part of the solution with community renewables. This isn't radical. It's a middle-of-the-road idea. It's mainstream European social democracy. Even Jacob Rees-Mogg is now talking about capping energy profits and understanding that trickle-down economics isn't working the way that right-wing think tanks thought it would. In 1986, Thatcher's Telsyd advert offered us a stake in a share-owning democracy. But most of us don't feel that that's terribly meaningful or real for us right now. So we can't afford to stick with this misguided ideology. And if you agree with that, please sign up to We Own It. 66% of the British public want energy in public hands, and for the sake of people and the planet, we have to have an energy system that isn't entirely geared around profit. Thank you.
Thank you, Kat, for such an excellent set of remarks. Next, move across the opposition and to Andrew Lillico. Andrew is an author, journalist, economist, and political commentator. He is the executive director and principal of Europe Economics and writes a number of platforms, including The Telegraph, Unheard, and The Guardian. He's also, I'm informed, an opera singer in a past life. Andrew, you have the ears of the House.
Thank you very much. I urge you to vote against this motion. I urge you to vote against it for two key reasons. First of all, it is misdirected, and secondly, it would make things worse. Clearly, the motivation for this particular motion at this time is the very high energy prices that we experience. To understand what's going on with very high energy prices, we first need to understand a little bit about what a grid is. Again, thinking about our definitions here at Cambridge. So what does the grid mean? In the energy sector, we can think of there as being three levels. One level is where power is generated, and perhaps, depending on whether you're thinking about gas or electricity or other things, the inputs for that, the oil, the gas, and so on. So that rank of the energy sector is highly competitive and highly competitive in the international market. We're talking about the solar farms, all of the wind turbines, the offshore wind, the gas-fired plants, the nuclear plants, and we're also talking about the suppliers from, Qatar Gas and oil companies and all kinds of things all around the world. We're talking about thousands of companies. We're also talking about, for example, all of the inputs, the microgeneration, like my mother has solar panels on her roof, so she kind of inspects how much energy she's sticking into the grid just at the moment all the time. So that kind of thing also counts as part of the energy supply, that first network. The second is the distribution and transmission of energy. That's the bit in which the grid sits. A third rank, and that bit we can think of as a natural monopoly. A third rank is the retail energy sector. That's where the bulbs and so on sit about. That's sort of competitive via some fancy pants regulatory framework. Doesn't work terribly well all of the time, but that's at least notionally competitive. So we have these three different rankings. A key thing to understand in terms of my first objection to this motion is where the energy price issue sits. It isn't that the national grid are somehow charging enormous amounts for their services. It isn't that the retailers have somehow found some way of charging enormously higher margins on the things in the past. The issue arises at the level, the highly competitive international market level of the power generation. And it's very expensive at the moment because there isn't enough energy. That's why the prices are very high. There isn't enough energy from a combination of factors. One of it is some of the implications of Putin's invasion of Ukraine, which has led to in the European market in particular, cutting off its purchases of Russian gas, which was a very large portion, 40% or so of Germany's gas, for example. Are we past the minute? You're most welcome.
It only imported 3% of its gas from Russia. Why are we ending up spending more for worse outcomes? Could it possibly have something to do with the fact we have such a mesh of different privatized interests and we sold off all our storage? So don't you think that, in fact, the administrative dysfunction is part of the reason why this terrible system cannot withstand a crisis?
The key reason why it has an impact... The key reason why it has an impact on us is that we buy our energy internationally. We sell energy through to our allies internationally, and we buy it from them. It would seem to me to be most unfortunate if, for example, we decided at the moment, in the context of trying to build solidarity against the Russians, if we then said, well, we're going to keep all of the energy which we produce in the UK, and we're not going to send any to the French, for example, because that is another of the cases in which one of the factors which is leading to high energy prices at the moment. I'll just make a little progress. I'll take another one in a minute. The COVID crisis and various shutdowns in that led to a reduction in maintenance. And that meant that, as a consequence of having reduced maintenance, a number of the French power stations have had maintenance problems and they've had to go offline for some time. That has led to another source of diminution in capacity. At the same time, of course, we also have some movement towards more green energy. That's perfectly proper over the medium term, but Putin managed to pick a clever moment just when a number of plants were coming offline. Go on, you're most welcome, yep. Well, somebody said that somebody, yep. Absolutely. The reason why they're making lots of money is because they're the ones that have the stuff to sell. And the reality is that if we didn't pay the prices which they want, then we wouldn't get the gas. It's no good us saying we're going to go to Qatar Gas and we're not going to pay your price, or we're going to go to some Saudi oil company and say we're not going to pay the price. There may be some moves within Europe, and there are in fact moves within Europe, to aim to have a kind of buyer's cartel where they tell the Norwegians the price that they're going to pay for the gas. Whether the Norwegians will put up with that remains to be seen. But there are efforts to engage in that coordinated activity. But the key reason why the prices are high is that there just isn't enough energy. That's why. Because the prices are high, that means that when it goes to the transmission and distribution companies, again, they're buying it in. It's coming into them at a high price. They're not taking any increased margin on this at the moment. They have regulated prices. And then when it goes through to the retailers, what's happened with the retailers, in fact, it went into last year, a number of the retailers went bust, partly because of the price cap. Now, just let me make a little bit more progress on this point here again. In terms of the way in which the market functions, we've now seen what these three kinds of layers are. And there are different arguments for how you should treat those different layers. So the highly competitive part of the market, what we've done up to now in order to encourage renewables generation is that we've decided that the amount that would be paid for renewables generation would be defined by the gas price. So that meant that if you were a gas-fired plant and the price of providing gas-fired energy got very high, then we ended up paying very high prices to the renewables companies as well. That's being amended in current regulation so that we place things in different boxes. So we have a kind of high capacity energy where you can change it very quickly, where we pay one kind of a price, and then you'd have this sort of more underlying, slower kind of energy created particularly by the renewables companies, where we pay a lower price. And so it's not that the market is configured perfectly, but I'll come to the point that that's nothing to do with the grid. The grid part of the market is subject to price regulation through Ofgem. And what that happens with them is that their costs are assessed, and they're subject to some incentive regulation to reduce their costs over time. That's then passed through to customers in terms of lower transmission costs, and then they're allowed a reasonable rate of return. That system isn't perfect either. So, for example, my team assessed what the allowed rate of return should be for the energy sector in 2010. The energy regulator, in its wisdom, decided to allow them a higher number. In my view, that was partly the consequence why they ended up with, for some years, excessive profits, because they've been allowed too high a rate of return relative to their costs. Probably at the moment, things are the reverse. The most recent assessment of their costs probably has been overtaken by events with increasing interest rates and inflation and all of that, and now means that probably the allowance which they have is a little bit low. So these things can be improved, and there's tweaks that you go either way. There's an element of swings and roundabouts, but that's the reality of that. It's not perfect. Again, it's not perfect at the final level either in terms of the retail. But a thing that I would urge upon you is, sorry, did you want to make another point? Yep.
I mean, you've talked about tweaks being needed. How on earth is it the case that we've ended up like this? We were the least dependent on Russian gas. Why has the system imploded if the only thing we need to change is minor tweaks? Surely the entire system is rotten.
I don't agree that the system has imploded. What has happened is that there's a lack of something, and so the price of that thing has gone up. That's the market working, not the market failing. That's a simple consequence of the fact that we have a lack of energy around. So it doesn't seem to me that the solution here would be, for example, for us to seek energy independence and only make our own energy and never trade it, never sell it to anybody or buy from anybody. That would seem to be a terrible mistake. It's much better to participate in international markets because these are highly competitive markets. A point that I would make about some of these tweaks is, absolutely, you can always talk about improving regulation, but it's much better, and you're much more likely to improve your regulation if you maintain the proper separation between the regulator and the things you are regulating. So if, for example, you were to have, so some of the people I advise internationally, in some countries, you find that the regulator, the regulated firm, the energy firm, is owned by the state. And then when you speak to them, then they'll often say, oh, well, we can't do this and that, the other thing that the regulators try to make us do because the government says we have to do something else. And it creates a conflict. I'm afraid I'm in my final minute now. So it's important to maintain that separation. It makes regulation more effective and credible and reduces the conflicts of interest in it. It also means that you don't end up with the investment in energy firms being stuck in the same box as other kinds of investment. We're likely to have an austerity program very shortly, fiscal consolidation in the UK. Part of that's likely to involve a cut in government investment. If you had the investment in your energy utilities, then you would be subject, as part of that pot, you would be subject to the political cycle and find that you had reductions in your energy investment that were driven not by the needs of the energy sector or by appetite for energy, but by the political cycle and the fiscal cycle. And a third thing is that it is helpful for there to be carrots as well as sticks. So it's good to have a surplus motive for firms that outperform, that are more efficient than the regulator says, that buy in their factors of production at lower costs and so on, that they get rewarded for that. If you have that it's only a state-owned enterprise, all you have is the stick. All you can do is you force people by chasing them in order to do things. They get nothing out of it by outperforming. So for these kinds of reasons, if you were to nationalize the system, you would find it was less efficient over time, it innovated less, the quality of your services would be reduced, and in the end, your cost would also be higher. So for these two reasons, I urge you to oppose the motion. Just to rehearse them again, the motion is misdirected. It isn't the grid that is the source of the high energy prices. It's the lack of energy internationally that's the source of the high energy prices. And secondly, if you were to take this solution, you would make things worse, not better, because it's better if the regulator is separated from the thing they regulate, and if you bring them together, you end up with lower quality, less innovation, higher prices, and poorer services in the end.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for such a fine speech. I move now to you, the members, for a round of floor speeches. A reminder, floor speeches is a 1 to 2 minute speech for your side of the motion. Starting with proposition. You were a very fast hand there, you didn't get your point, so I'll let you. Yeah. If you could give us your name and college for the record as well, that'd be very helpful.
I'm Louis Goldberg from Robinson College. I would support nationalisation of not only the grid, but of all energy companies and everything involved in the energy industry. David Hall says that the issue is that there's not enough energy. But the reason there's not enough energy is because private firms have become reliant on oil and gas, not in the national interest, because we know that oil and gas prices will tend to fluctuate. So why didn't we do what the French national energy system did and invest in nuclear or renewable energy? And that way there wouldn't be not enough energy. The problem isn't not enough energy, but private energy firms which have no interest other than short-term profit. They don't care that, in 10 years there'll be a crisis in the Middle East, or Putin will do this, or whatever will happen that will cause prices to go up. Because I'm making profits right now. I'm the CEO. I'm here for another 5 years. I want to make money for my investors. The simple issue is that energy is not a space for capitalism. People don't like being a consumer of energy, as in they don't like consumerism. I like to go to the shop and choose my brand of biscuits or my tracksuit, but I do not like researching online what company offers the cheapest energy. And filling in lots of forms to change my supplier and doing all that is simply not a sector that promotes competition. It makes no sense. And energy is an issue of national security. Why are we handing it over to these companies, lots of whom aren't actually British companies, some of whom are very efficiently run state-owned companies like ENF? Yes? What? Sorry. Oh, sorry, I've got to conclude. Could you say that again?
You said you don't enjoy buying energy. That's not something that people do, therefore it's not competitive, therefore people don't enjoy that the way you go out and buy other products.
Well, it's a fuss. What I'm saying is switching your energy provider is a fuss, and lots of people don't do it, and as a result, they end up getting stuck with an energy provider who's ripping them off. Same way that you might get stuck with an internet provider that's ripping you off, because ordinary people don't have the time to constantly be checking, does BT have a better deal? Does Virgin Media have a better deal? Or would I be getting a better deal from British Gas? Because that's a waste of time. And what would not be a waste of time would be a nationalised company that provides everyone energy at the same price and would be held accountable by voters at every election.
Thank you very much. Moving across now to the abstention side. You were the first hand I saw.
Name and college, right?
That'd be wonderful, yeah. No, it's on, don't touch it.
Okay, Benjamin Reynolds, Emmanuel College. I'd like to speak to an abstention today because I feel some really interesting points have been raised on both sides. Of course, it is a highly unstable energy system, obviously has been in this country, that has been so rocked by sort of price rises, despite the fact that we only import 3% of our gas from Russia. This is clearly an unstable system, and a system that needs some sort of reform to it, or change, as it has been so massively rocked by such a sort of what we can sort of look at as small. However, I do believe that the proposition has somewhat erroneously held Norway up as a paragon. The Norwegian Wealth Fund is based, sovereign wealth fund that you mentioned earlier, is based almost solely on the exploitation of Norway's natural resources, i.e. oil and gas. They have been in this position because they have exploited their natural resources and have used them, sold them on the world market, selling fossil fuels, profiteering massively from it, whilst countries like Britain have shied away from exploiting our natural resources, such as North Sea oil, and shied away from that, and instead focused on building renewable options. So I would like to underline...
We did exploit our oil reserves in the 80s, and we used it to fund tax cuts. Oil
I think that's an extremely correct point of information. I should like to underline again that the reason why Norway is able to do this is because they do have that riches tapped in by continuing to sell fossil fuels. I'd say the main issue I think I'm currently having the proposition and to some extent with the opposition in the sense that they're sort of focusing, in conclusion, I'd say either sort of, the proposition believes you need to focus on net zero and sort of lowering of budgets at the same time. Should we, at this stage, pick one or the other to ensure people don't freeze this winter and then perhaps focus on net zero at a later date?
And finally, I'm looking for someone on the opposition side. I'll go to you. It might take a second to get a mic to you, right in the rafters. Do we have... Sorry, I'm getting unpopular with AV for doing this.
Throughout this debate, there's been two things that have been incredibly unclear to me. The first is whether government ownership is equivalent to government operations, because I feel like that is a clear and important distinction that has not been made, because the second thing that's incredibly unclear is why the government is any better actor. The only justification that the proposition side has been giving so far is that government is democratic, and democracy is, this hasn't even been explicitly said, but presumably implicitly a good thing. Yet, the speaker from the floor just told us that the last time we had natural resources under state ownership, we, explicit quote, used them incredibly badly. So I feel like this is a reason why we should not own the state resources. Yeah, sure, go ahead.
They were not nationalised. They were privatised companies, but that to just tax them badly and then use the tax revenue that we did get from the North Sea oil to provide tax cuts.
The North Sea oil was originally discovered and mostly used during the time of technological development under Harold Wilson before the privatization of energy. So I'm pretty sure this is factually incorrect.
Thank you very much, and I'm glad to see people getting involved. That's really wonderful. We will have another round of floor speeches. Order! Order! We will have a second round of floor speeches so you can make all the points you've got on the tip of your tongue. But I move back to our paper speakers and to Professor David Hall. David Hall is a visiting professor at the University of Greenwich, London, in the Public Services International Research Unit, of which he was previously director. He researches politics, law and economics of public services, public finance, public ownership, privatisation, PPPs and outsourcing. David, you have the floor. The floor is yours.
Okay. Nevertheless, I'm grateful to Andrew for ending on the note of the problem of investment, because I want to talk about some economic realities as opposed to some of the economic theory. Okay. Did anybody hear any of what I said? Yeah, okay, good. The empirical evidence, however, suggests that that is very much not what happens, and I spent a happy day yesterday going through the accounts of some of our distribution and transmission companies to check. And in fact, what happens is that we pay a lot of money in charges, which pay for the operating costs of the companies. We're talking National Grid, we're talking distribution companies. The surplus after that, after the operating expenditure, is then used to finance all the capital expenditure. All the capital expenditure. The remaining surplus is then used to finance the financial costs of interest payments and so on. And then the shareholders, who you will have noticed feature nowhere in this story so far, then take dividends. This is an absence of investment by shareholders. If you swept the shareholders out the system altogether, which is what public ownership would do, we would lose no investment whatsoever because they're not investing money. However, they are taking money out, and considerable money. It's not often discussed. Somebody commented earlier it's not the grids which are pushing up energy prices, but they are pushing up energy prices significantly by virtue of this private system. Let's take UK Power Networks, for example, which Kat mentioned as having taken out nearly £500 million in dividends in the last 2 years. That covers London, the South East, and east of England, i.e. round here. Let's take National Grid's gas grid and the electricity transmission grids, which between them took out, I think just about, I'm sorry, I've lost my original notes, but about 1 billion in dividends this year. And their Western Power distribution subsidiaries who took out a further 200 million. Just out of those companies, which still leaves untouched a number of distribution companies of gas and electricity, that's 1.8 billion in dividends over 2 years. A few years ago, we estimated, as Kat mentioned, that about 3.7 billion was being paid by us in excess dividends and unnecessarily high interest payments each year. Each year. That's the equivalent of over £100 per household. That's the equivalent of £2 per week. All of us, every household in the country, is paying £2 a week, which goes straight through the pipeline. It's a financial diarrhea. It goes straight from us to the shareholders. It's not used for anything, and they send nothing back, which may be fortunate. I don't want to pursue the metaphor. The loss on interest rates is because governments can always borrow money cheaper than private companies. And I'm very conscious that this is a terrible week to be making this argument. But I suspect even at this worst of times, the government can still borrow money more cheaply than the private sector. Okay, so that's the real economic cost. That kind of cost shows up elsewhere in the system and in other networks like water as well. The other argument, however, because that argument is really about the cost of capital, and it's an argument that, for example, the IMF and the World Bank and the OECD all acknowledge, and they all say, okay, that means the private sector will always be more expensive because of the high cost of capital, but it has to be offset by the extra efficiency. And somebody said, okay, so the private sector manages things more efficiently, doesn't it? Okay, there is now empirical evidence on this as well. There have been hundreds of studies, comparative studies on public-private sector efficiency over the last 24 years. There have been far too many. I say it personally, I've had to read most of them. Fortunately, there have been a number of excellent meta-reviews. Yes? Mm. Yeah, that's a very good methodological point, but the conclusion, I think, is the opposite of the one you've drawn. People have made the point, and there was a detailed study of privatizations in Europe and elsewhere, which pointed out that the companies that have been privatized have almost always been selected as being the most profitable looking public companies, and therefore the ones that got privatized were the best. And so study was done to adjust for that, and what they found was that after adjusting for that, there was no significant difference. And that's the consistent result of studies across the energy sector, across all parts of the energy sector. There's a professor of energy economics here called Michael Pollitt, who was and still is a strong believer in privatization, but his own studies showed, he looked at 790 different generating companies around the world, compared public and private, and the result was no significant difference in efficiency. He then had a look with colleague David Newbury at the efficiency impact of the restructuring and privatisation of the UK system. What happened? Not much evidence of efficiency gains, but big shift in distribution. Shareholders made lots of extra money, consumers paid high prices. In other words, from public's point of view, it was not a success. Pollitt again did a study of the unbundling of the system into separate parts, which Andrew was talking about, in the USA specifically, and found that there were serious negative impacts on the efficiency of the distribution companies after they'd been separated from generation. So even from supporters of privatization, the empirical evidence is acknowledged to show this has not worked. Newbury once put it as the evidence requires sober reflection. In other words, we've made a terrible mistake, and we're all suffering as a result. Okay, I've got 1 minute left to tell you a lot of other things as well, which I won't manage, but I'll do something. Is the project of public ownership an unreasonable one, an unnatural one, a kind of fringe project by some extreme group of people who are just not up to speed with modernity? No. As Kat said, actually public ownership remains normal elsewhere in the world. I was looking earlier at a map of a big survey carried out a few years ago, again by Pollitt, showing all the countries in the world that had 100% all their electricity distribution companies privatized. And it showed, you could see on a simple picture of the whole world, there's the UK, there is Turkey, and there is Chile. And there is one other that escapes my mention. Everywhere else is a mixture or still publicly owned. These things are perfectly normal. In France, Electricité de France has been mentioned a few times. Germany has 900 Stadtwerke, municipal energy companies. These are normal. They generate. Not only do they generate in Germany, Stadtwerke Munich owns one of the biggest offshore wind farms in the UK waters. The public sector companies of Europe generate our offshore wind renewable electricity. So this is perfectly normal. It's normal. It's not universal in the US. It's not even majority in the US, but it is pervasive in the US. And one thing that the US doesn't do is it doesn't have our retail markets, our supply markets. I just want to tell this story because before most of you were born, I guess, in the year 2000, California celebrated by liberalizing its electricity and creating a retail supply market with competition in inverted commas. Couldn't go wrong, could it? Except that much of California suffered rolling blackouts and power cuts for the best part of a year, the 5th biggest economy in the world being constantly closed down because a bunch of opportunist power companies saw the opportunity to operate a cartel and force power prices up. An economic disaster of the first order. It had consequences. California said, okay, enough is enough. Every other state in the USA said, we are not going near the creation of a retail competitive market. And to this day, no one has moved in that direction in the USA. However, here in the UK, we are still stuck with it. It's time we abandoned this terrible experiment on ourselves and adopted a publicly owned, efficiently financed, and public, democratically driven, accountable energy system. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David, for that fine speech. And I move across the floor to Ben Wilson. Ben is the Chief Strategy and External Affairs Officer of the National Grid. Previously, he was CEO of the Australian Gas Infrastructure Group, one of the largest utility infrastructure businesses in Australia. He has more than 25 years of experience in the energy sector internationally. Ben, you have the ears of the House.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Is it working? Yeah. It's really nice to be here in this amazing building and to be able to represent National Grid and address this motion. National Grid is one of the largest companies in the UK. I think we're number 14 on the FTSE. We're a UK-listed company. We operate electricity and gas networks in the UK and in the US. We're about 50-50 UK-US. We are a great British success story. We are an emerging energy supermajor, clean energy supermajor for the 21st century. This is a really interesting time to be having this debate. Interesting. We have two very serious crises going on in energy at the moment. We have an affordability crisis, which is short-term and right on top of us, and we have a climate crisis, which is longer term, but is more serious than the affordability crisis. Two crises at the same time. If we rewind just over a year, the average dual-fuel electricity and gas bill in the UK was £1,300. That was the off-gen price cap. Before the government intervention recently, it would have been £3,500 from the 1st of October this year, so nearly tripled. And the forecasts show it going to £5,000 or £6,000. The government has intervened to cap it at £2,500 on average volumes at a cost of £150 billion. And that number is a big number, and energy is big. There was a comment earlier around we shouldn't have capitalism in energy. Well, we've got a lot of capital in energy. We don't have a choice on this matter. Energy is very, very big. Why are energy prices so high? There's been a lot of questions around that. The answer is the price of gas. Europe is dependent on Russian gas, particularly Germany and Italy. And now, with the war in Ukraine and the weaponizing of energy by Vladimir Putin, we have a gas shortfall in Europe. The UK, we never took much gas from Russia, about 3 or 4%. Our gas came 1/3 North Sea production, 1/3 Norwegian North Sea production, coming by dedicated pipelines from Norway, and 1/3 imports. And it's those imports you have to pay the market price. And the market price is influenced by what Vladimir Putin has done with his war on Ukraine. That is, yep.
As you just admitted, spending $150 billion on propping up this failing private system. Why should we, as taxpayers, not demand some shares in return so that we can profit back once this immediate crisis recedes?
So I think you're possibly alluding to the possibility of a windfall tax on upstream oil and gas companies. That's a policy matter for the government. I'm not going to comment on whether that. I'll be very careful on what I say. Okay. So that's affordability. Climate crisis. We need to rapidly decarbonize to get back on a 1.5 degrees Celsius maximum global warming. We need to build renewables to do that. If there's a silver lining from these two crises, it is that we no longer have an energy trilemma. Traditionally, we've said there's a trilemma. We need to decarbonize, keep costs down, and also maintain reliability. And we think the renewables are expensive and intermittent, so that they're in tension. Not anymore. Renewables are by far the cheapest form of generation now, not by a little, but by a lot. Multiples cheaper than gas. Yeah.
You said that because energy is big, we can't keep capitalism out of it. I would say that healthcare is big, and we try and keep capitalism out of it. Education is big, and we try and keep capitalism out of it. I don't understand why its size.
Yeah, I'll come to that point in a minute. So we need to build. What do we need to do to fix this crisis? It goes to this point of nationalisation not being the issue. We need to build lots and lots of renewables as quickly as we can, and we need to build a lot of grid to bring that power. A lot of that renewables will be in the North Sea. There are no customers in the North Sea. All customers approximately are in the southeast. We need to build a lot of transmission lines. That's what we need to do. I'll come to the motion, nationalising the grid. National Grid, of that now 2,500 capped, 3,500 a year uncapped, we are £20 a year. That is the amount of the bill that goes to the transmission system, the high voltage transmission system, £20 a year. To privatise that nationally, yes.
25% of our bills goes towards transmission and distribution. Just to clarify, I don't know the percentage that goes to National Grid, but it's a quarter of your bill goes to the grid, transmission and distribution.
When the bill was £1,300 a year, not anymore. It's much smaller share now, for sure. No, that's not correct. That's not correct. I wouldn't say it if it wasn't, right? So if we nationalise National Grid, we're talking about a part of the bill which is £20 a year out of 2,500. It will cost about £20 billion to do that. The government does not have £20 billion. We have seen that with the fiscal reaction over the last few weeks. Also, there's a lot of talk. Yep. That's exactly where I'm going next. That's exactly where I'm going next. It has been said that if we nationalise something, then that wouldn't have to make a profit anymore, and therefore we could pass those savings on to customers. You cannot have it both ways. If we pay £20 billion for something and then drop the revenues so it makes no money, it is worth nothing when you've done that. It is worth nothing. So we just spent £20 billion on nothing. If you halved our charges, and the profit element is much less than half, but if you half that price charges, that's £10 a year off the bill. It doesn't make any difference. So nationalisation of the grid will not make a difference to the affordability challenge. It will also, one benefit of having the grids in private ownership, firstly, the tariffs are set by the regulator, so we still have control over the tariffs. You can have different owners of different grids, and you can have comparative competition. So if one grid has got really good reliability and one hasn't, the regulator can say, well, that's clearly achievable, you need to do that too. If it's all owned by the government, you don't get that comparative competition. Comparative competition has very significantly improved customer service, reliability, and cost efficiency over the last 25 years. Looks like there's a point here.
On point of information about the proposal is not that nationalisation would eliminate the making of a profit by the company. The point is that nationalisation would eliminate the extraction of that profit into the pockets of private shareholders, and instead what is now extracted in the shape of 3.7 billion would remain within the company to be used either for price reductions or for greater investment.
So, firstly, if we nationalise, the tariffs are already fixed, so unless we change the tariffs, it has no impact. If you reduce the tariffs, then immediately what you've bought suddenly is not worth what you've paid for it, and that's a waste of money. That's a distraction. No, you go. I'll take the points together. Yes. Yes. You can do that you can set an appropriate tariff level without having to take it into public ownership. That is what we do today, and we're talking £20 on the bill out of 3,500 pre-subsidy.
If this regulator is working so well, why on earth are we in the position that we are in today?
We need to build. I mean, let's be clear. Let's be clear. The reason that bills have increased so much over the last year is because there is a war in Europe, and the person that is prosecuting that war is using energy as a weapon. That is just a fact. That is the situation we're in. It is a further driver to the one that exists anyway as to why we need to get off fossil fuels and onto renewables. I'll address just a couple of the other points that were made. We do not need nationalisation to control prices. There have been examples given around Europe of countries with significant levels of state ownership, France being one. We are in a much better place than France as we go into this winter. We are much less dependent on Russian gas, and we don't have a whole load of nuclear power stations facing significant outages. So that is not a good example to look at, France. We are in a much better place than France is the point that I would make. Well, I might do the reverse of Cat and then just open a little bit wider, because I suspect that the question of nationalisation is not narrowly directed just to the transmission grid. I think when you think about, is there a role for the government and state elsewhere in the energy sector, nuclear is an obvious example where there could be. Nuclear risks are difficult to bear by the private sector, and you may say that actually new nuclear in this country is state-owned. It's just the French government, not the British government, that owns it. So I think there is a consideration in nuclear. In renewables, we do not object to the announcement from the Labour Party of the Great British Energy State Renewables Company. What we wouldn't want to see, though, is crowding out of private investment, because the amount that we need to spend is in the hundreds of billions over the next 20 years, and that cannot all be afforded by the government balance sheet. So we mustn't crowd out private investment. So look, in summary, I agree with my colleague here. The motion is misdirected. The cause of high prices is gas and Putin's war and our dependence on gas. Privatising the national grid will cost £20 billion, which we don't have, and if we did, we should be spending it on the NHS, and is a part of the bill which is only £20 out of 2,500. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ben. I move now to the floor and a speech and proposition. You were before I spoke, so I'll hand over to Ewan.
Ewan Woods, Corpus Christi College. Whilst it obviously makes sense in the current environment to focus on the question of oil and gas, considering Russia's actions in Ukraine, we have to remember that nationalising or even privatising any industry will be a medium to long-term question. So the main focus around this debate should be on nuclear, should be on solar, and should be on wind. We are not dependent as much on an international market on the regulation of price for nuclear, from solar and wind. If we were to nationalise the grid, we'd be much more able to set those prices as we needed for the particular moment that we're in. And I also think, looking back to the first opposition speaker's breakdown of the three divisions of the energy market, in some ways, it reminds me of the NHS, which is the largest medical buyer of drugs in the world, which means it has the great advantage of more or less setting prices for drugs in most environments. And considering how small the UK is, yet how much buying power the National Health Service has, it feels to me like more or less a simply logical assumption that if we were to nationalise our grid, our second rung of our energy provider, we would have a similar amount of buying power for our energy as well. So even on the matter of oil, on the matter of gas, on the matter of these things which will hopefully fall out of use, isn't it? Where is this? Yes, go on.
We already set the price of our solar and wind through an auction-based system with contracts different.
I don't deny that. I mean, I wasn't aware of that, but even still, I don't think that changes my argument too much, because, thank you, it will still get us to a position where we can set the prices ourselves if it's run in-house, so we can actually get a market which functions as best as possible for the British people.
Thank you, Ewan. Before we go to abstention, very nerdy point, but worth clarifying. A point of information is to the speaker on their speech. A point of order is to me on my chairing of the debate. So just so people know for the future. Not very important, but I just thought worth wrapping up. Speeches for abstention. You call me first, right at the back. You have name and college for the record, please, and just wait for a mic to get to you.
Hey, Adam from Homerton. I don't have too strong of an opinion on nationalization, but this is more of a call to center the debate on the pros and cons of the grid. We've heard arguments from both of the speakers of the opposition as to why the current problems, the energy crisis, lie elsewhere. All well and good. Gas is tough to come by with the current war in Ukraine. But there have been no arguments as to why the grid itself should be privatized. You say that we should regulate the companies, but we cap their profits, and so the way that they extract money is through financial engineering, which is why the UK government itself stepped in to nationalize part of the grid recently. So this is mostly an appeal on the opposition side to make some arguments as to why the grid itself should remain in private hands and not talk about the crisis that we have now. That's not the grid's fault. Thank you.
Thank you. And over to the opposition, right in the front.
My name is Sarah. I am a student at Westfield House in the Cambridge Theological Federation. The case for why it is beneficial to the public for the grid to remain in the private sector comes from the drive for innovation. The drive for innovation is best expressed through capitalism. The reason that it is expressed better through capitalism than through being held in the public hands is because a privately owned company is intended to make as much profit as possible. You can only make profit when your product is the best product on the market. Therefore, when you have multiple energy companies competing on the grid for consumers, they are more likely.
Monopolies. So, for example, UK Power Networks distributes energy to a certain region of the UK. There is no competition. National Grid does the transmission. The regional distribution companies have areas that they cover, just like the water companies. You don't get a choice about which water company you use. You don't get a choice that you're using UK Power Networks to have your energy distributed to you. So the whole competitive market isn't operating, and therefore it's not driving that kind of argument that would apply in a proper market.
Real thing. This is not just an academic point. It really is the case that if of the 6 distribution groups, if one of them is delivering much better reliability, the others get set targets by the regulator to hit that level. So there really is competition. If they were all owned by the government, that wouldn't happen. You wouldn't have that. You need that ownership diversity to drive comparative competition. It's a real point. It's the lived experience.
When you are in an area where one area is controlled by a grid, you do have the option to move to another area, which is, I'll admit, it's not a great solution. However, there is still this competition, and it is the choice of the consumers where they are living to an extent, and that is not where I was intending to go with this. I was intending to talk about the drive for innovation to create the best product on the market. Thank you.
We started on time, which is rare, so you've got time to go around one more time on the floor speeches. So back to proposition. Just at the back there in the black puffer.
Hello, Ruben Austin, Robinson College. So I'm going to look at this through a bit of a different lens. I'm going to look at the aims of nationalisation in the first place and take this away from the current energy crisis that we're in. If we look at the purpose of nationalisation, it's to provide goods and services which are not a choice, they're a requirement. You don't choose to use energy, you need it. In order to survive, you have to be able to cook your food, you have to be able to have access to heating. You cannot realistically live your life without this, in the same way that we require a national health service to provide the services that we require when we become ill and unable to care for ourselves. It's a human right to expect the state to care for you when you invest in the state itself. This can be best controlled and affected into practice by the state controlling these policies, in my opinion. Okay, but the right to live a life that is unimpeded by the state, and for the state to actually provide for you in a way where you can actually be realistically expected to live your life in a fulfilled way, when you're paying into the state through taxes and through being a contributing member of society, is surely a fair expectation to have. Thank you.
A final floor speech and abstention. Right at the back in the blue shirt.
So I'm Oscar Beach Union, St Catherine's College. I just have sort of one main point to sort of ask to each of the sides, and I'm wondering if this might be addressed in their sort of final speeches. So I'll start with the proposition first. And I'm just sort of thinking, you know, in another world where we did have nationalised sort of energy grids and energy companies, and then we had sort of 2010s austerity of, you know, George Osborne, David Cameron, do we really believe that they would have invested significant amounts in the grid? I mean, we've seen the damage that they've done to the HS2 project. It hasn't even got off the ground yet. So do we really think that they would put a significant amount of money into grid infrastructure? And then my question to the opposition is that, you know, the money for infrastructure does actually have to come from somewhere, right? From the government, it comes from government bonds. From the private sector, it comes from private investment. But private investment always confers a risk, and you can sort of say, well, actually, it isn't a risk because they get bailed out in the end, and maybe that is a problem. But, you know, the risk means that they have a higher cost in their interest rates than government bonds. Most of the time, maybe not now, but, you know, that's the government's fault. You know, normally they have a higher interest rate. So actually, we end up paying a small proportion of money every month for a higher interest rate loan to a private company for a so-called risk that actually ends out with a bailout from the government of our own money. So, you know, on the opposition, how is a private equity investment better than a public equity investment in a privatized system?
And then closing for the floor speeches, I'm looking for a point in opposition. Just at the back there.
Thank you. Patrick Weed, Downing College. I'd just like to start by responding to one of the first floor speakers in proposition of the motion back there, who was saying that we all need energy to survive and therefore we should nationalise it. Well, we also all need food and clothing, so following that logic, we should nationalise Marks and Spencer, which I don't think is really the way forwards for the country. But the real reason I wanted to talk about this is that this motion, as has already been mentioned several times by the opposition speakers, is based on a misunderstanding of what the problems are. The solution to this is that we do not have problems with profiteering in this country because they're trying to make profits. The reason we've been so badly affected by energy prices in this country is because the governments of both parties over the last 25 years have totally failed to give this country any sense of energy security at all. So I really don't see why we should suddenly start saying, these governments have done nothing for energy security, let's make them entirely responsible for this, for the nation's energy. Thank you.
Before I move to our two final paper speakers, a quick note. I think it's a little known secret that you can be in these debates. Every Saturday we put out an audition form to speak in the debates. Please apply, it'd be wonderful. Participate in the debate, speak, you get dinner beforehand, it's really worth doing. I thought people should know that. Moving across to students to do exactly that, I will invite Sammy MacDonald to open the case for close the case for side proposition. Sammy is a first-year undergraduate reading history at St John's College. He has an interest in geopolitics, cartography and debating, as well as MUN. He won the right to speak, as I said, through open audition. Sammy, you have the ears of the House.
So the first thing you're probably thinking is, why on earth am I even up here? I'm a first-year history student. You know, why am I standing here with clearly esteemed experts and energy executives? I want to posit to you all this. Anyone who is not outraged, who is not mortified, who is not concerned by the state of the energy market in the UK, well, I think you should turn your badge in. This is a really desperate situation. We have had a great storm, which has clearly been whipped up by Russia's appalling and barbaric invasion of Ukraine. We do not deny that. And the country appears to be imploding in a cycle of spiraling bills, inflation, and destitution. And all of us, especially young people in the room, have another great task ahead of us, the difficult and arduous task of decarbonizing our economy and laying for future generations a security. But we've got to ask ourselves, Do we want these tasks left to the short whim of executives who have clearly failed, who have not prepared the country, who wanted to pass the costs onto consumers rather than hurt their profit margins? Do we want cash without consequence? Do we want public spending without any sense of public service? Or do we actually demand that a better future must be built out of this dark Russian winter, that we as taxpayers must get the right to determine our own future? I know that I have had enough of energy executives telling us it can't be done, it's not possible, and the only way is forking more cash without consequence. The only thing we can do now is nationalize these companies and nationalize the grid. I want to make three main points. One, that there is obviously a necessity for nationalization in the immediate crisis, but also opportunities provided by it. Two, that private investment in the grid only suits really short-termism and is not good for long-term investment that we need to decarbonize. And three, contrary to some of the other statements we've had on the floor, that energy should be a public right, and there is no such thing as a life well lived without an adequate and affordable supply of energy. Not at this time, no. I want to, just because I want to start with my first point, which is the opportunity and necessity provided by the current crisis. We have already heard admissions of how much we are just handing over without any precondition to energy companies, to the grid, to others, in order to prop up a clearly failing system. 150 billion. And this is not just an arbitrary sum on paper. We've had a lot of technical definitions, but this is going to inflate the economy. This is going to drive people into destitution. And even at this rate, 96% increases. How are the poorest families going to afford that? So, what's gone wrong? Is it perhaps something to do with some vague waffle about it's the green energy's fault? And in fact, we are, in the words of the opposition, this is a success story. This is a minor blip. This is an aberrance. Well, that does not explain why energy prices have been climbing above inflation, even at times of oil gluts. What we need to do is we need to make sure that out of this crisis comes a better opportunity. When are we going to admit this privatization experiment has failed? I want to explain why, precisely, it has failed so badly. So let's start with some of the claims for the opposition. So they've talked about Russian gas, and I understand this is significant. But let's compare the stats for a moment. The EU has imported 39% of its gas, and slightly more as a percent of its oil, I believe, before the invasion from Russia. The figure drops to just 5% from the UK. The UK received bounteous supplies of oil and gas from Norway back in the summer. The disruption to the UK, however, is demonstrably more severe than almost any other country in Europe. If you look at France, for example, they are spending what is equivalent to about 15 billion for only a 15% rise in prices. So where on earth could it have been going wrong? So we've had everybody's fault but mine from the opposition. We've had blame heaped upon every conceivable source. But maybe it is something to do with the fact that we have this Byzantine mesh of different privatized interests not working in tandem with each other. Let's take a look at EDF, for example. We, in fact, pay... go ahead.
So in France and in Germany, they are planning for blackouts this winter. We're not.
I don't believe Truss on that. I don't believe that will actually come into fruition. But if you look at the percentage that French consumers are paying, they're only paying 15% more year on year. Their rate of inflation at 6%. They're going to return to growth in 2023. The problem is demonstrably shorter. What is the difference? EDF is nationalized. EDF has been nationalized for a long time, and serious planning went into long-term security. It wasn't just this short-term rush for gas. France's energy could thus be more reactive and also have higher bargaining power, and I think this is a point not mentioned by the opposition. The EU, as I think they acknowledge, have just completely rushed us to secure other supplies of natural gas. These big EU firms, many of which have nationalized stake, including now Germany, which has nationalized most of its energy in response to the crisis, have these big nationalized stakes which they are using as leverage to buy up these oil supplies quickly. We cannot do that because we are still sacrificing everything on this altar of privatization. I await the day where this will work. No, thank you. So we are the aberrants in Europe. We are clearly the aberrants in Europe in not demanding something back. And I just wish to impress upon this House the amount of money we're spending. We're spending about 150 billion. Now, we have two choices. One, we continue with this failed model. We say, you know what, I'm going to agree with the opposition. This is, in fact, a remarkable success story. This is a minor tweak that is needed. 150 billion, it's a chicken feed, minor tweak. That's only, no thank you. That is needed. Or we could say, no, as taxpayers, we're going to stand up for ourselves. We're going to demand a return on our investment, and we are going to take it back into our hands. Because, I'm sorry, gentlemen, it doesn't look like you've done a fantastic job. I wish to, no thank you. I wish to go on to the second point, which is that orienting around profit, the profit motive, is something that is completely incompatible with the fight against climate change. Do we want a system designed around the short-term maximization of corporate profit, or do we want a system based on the long-term pursuit of net zero goals and long-term investments to unlock more capital in the long term? No, thank you, sorry, I'm in the middle of a point. The current approach is one which is addicted to short-termism, and look no further than gas storage. Now, the statistics here are almost unbelievable, but I can reassure you they're in fact true. Germany has stored 217 terawatt-hours of power, 162 in France. Guess where the UK is on the league table? We're below Denmark and Lithuania. And why is this? Because we allowed private companies to sell off all of our gas storage. And this is just an anecdote, and it's something that's clearly had very serious effects this winter, but it's actually a good indication of what the system runs on. It runs on the short-term maximization of profit. Now, let's think about climate change. Now, I acknowledge that we've made progress, but getting to net zero is going to be arduous. Don't let anyone tell you it's going to be easy. It's going to be arduous, it's going to require investment, it's going to require long-term decisions that won't profit us immediately in the short term, and it's going to get harder as we move closer to that zero. Do we really want to trust the same people who've crashed our energy market, who've proved completely incapable of dealing with any kind of gas shock, and have forced the UK into recession as a result, with our long-term security? I'll take the first. Well, I think Jacob Rees-Mogg will soon be on unemployment benefits and will soon be out of power. But I do think, I'll just on a more serious level, I do think, I'll come back to my point that governments have sufficiently more bargaining power, and I'll be justifying why I think energy is a fundamental right a bit later. So we are going to have other energy shocks. We're going to have things which require a connected, well-connected system, not this mesh of different privatized networks to respond. We can't have every cog spluttering in this broken machine. We need a nationalized energy sector with long-term planning, long-term investment, and long-term innovation in order to get to net zero. And a failure to do otherwise would be a severe betrayal of this generation by the last. I want to sort of make a final point in the concluding minutes of my speech, which is about energy as a fundamental right. Now, we've had some interesting interventions from the floor on this subject. We've had the idea that you can just move, you know, and I think it's really interesting how neither opposition speaker has really identified the gravity of the situation or have appeared to show the gravity of the situation. We already are in a country where 2 million people are in food banks. We're in a country where in the north, 20% of people are in fuel poverty, and that is a very difficult definition threshold to even reach. That means you can't heat your home. When it's cold and you do not have heating, the risk of pneumonia rises. The pressure on the NHS rises. We used to have a system where you had 30 to 50% excess mortality because of lack of heating. The idea that energy is not something that should be demanded by taxpayers, and instead we should sacrifice it on the altar of the privatization experiment, I find quite abhorrent, actually. I think energy should be a fundamental right of the citizens to demand. Government-owned energy would allow us, for example, to offer lower tariffs to people on lower incomes. We'd be able to act with more flexibility, and constituents could demand from the government and could hold them accountable when they can't. You cannot hold, currently, your company or any other companies accountable for what they've done. You cannot vote them out of office. You cannot call them to account for failures they have made. We need to end this experiment, and we need to bring it back. Now, I understand there's a lot of lobbying on this issue. There's a lot of administrative support for the government. There is millions spent to try and justify this privatization principle. But I just want to conclude by highlighting some of the consequences of this latest failure. The United Kingdom is spending the most of any country in Europe, despite being the least reliant on energy, to get one of the biggest hikes. We are told it has nothing to do with this Byzantine mesh, with the profiteering, with the racketeering. Well, ladies, gentlemen, and everyone in this house, I think it's finally time to say enough is enough, and we demand as our right as taxpayers to influence this system. The long-term security of this planet and the security of old age and the security of the poorest in our society depend on it. And I urge you to be compassionate, to understand that energy is something that we should all own and we should all be responsible for society. So it's a time to say to the national grid and to everyone else, enough is enough, and we as the people are taking back control now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sami, for an excellent speech. Moving now to Madansh Kumar to close the case for the opposition and the debate as a whole. Madansh is a second-year student reading law at Trinity College. He won the right to speak through open audition. Madansh, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you, Lara. Ladies and gentlemen, so far we've heard rather a lot about capitalism and communism and the varying form of governments in between. I propose to bring a new dimension, to move beyond political theory and move to history. Let me remind this House about something that happened probably before most of our parents were born. Let me talk to you about a little something called the Yom Kippur War, which was a conflict between Israel and Palestine, very non-controversial subject, but it was an Israel-Arab-Palestinian, yes? Well, not really, but well, I'm in protected time.
You don't have to.
Okay, go on.
I was going to say, this is just a factual correction. It was not a conflict between Israel and Palestine. It was a conflict between Israel, Egypt, Transjordan, and Syria.
Which was related to the Palestinian cause, and there were, in fact, Palestinian fighters involved. Anyway, the point is, as a result of support offered to the State of Israel, there was an oil embargo placed upon a number of Western countries, which resulted in a rise in oil and energy prices, and in fact, to pretty damaging economic repercussions. My point, ladies and gentlemen, is this. When you have a war in Europe, you are going to experience higher energy prices. Now, it is true that the UK only imports about 3 or 4% of its natural gas from Russia. No, thank you. The point, however, is this. When you have a global scarcity in the oil markets, as happened in the Yom Kippur War, as happened when Saudi Arabia cut production of oil in the recent past, you are going to experience price rises in fuel markets because of the fundamental laws of demand and supply, which sadly we cannot change unless we turn this entire planet into some version of the Paris Commune. The second point I want to make is this. No, thank you. The second point I want to make is this. We've consistently heard from side proposition that private companies are inflicted by short-termism. Fair enough. To which I ask, is the government of the day not inflicted by short-termism? Are we seriously saying that an administration... yes?
We wouldn't be asking the government to directly run things. Jacob Rees-Mogg would not be in charge of the national grid. We would have well-run organisations operating in the public interest and returning a profit back into the services.
Right. So a number of issues with that, admittedly idealistic point, and that could potentially have worked, but the legal position in this country has changed. After the Thatcher administration and through the administration of Tony Blair, you see the development of what is called the new public model. And that means that even bodies which are ostensibly owned by the state run in substantial ways like private companies and have limited amounts of government oversight. And the current structure of administrative law in the United Kingdom is such that any nationalised grid, even though, as earlier speakers on my side have pointed out, that isn't really what we're talking about here. But any sort of nationalised grid-type infrastructure would operate in that fashion, and so would not be susceptible to the sort of control exerted by administrative law through the procedures of judicial review that we see today, with bodies of a more public character. However, even... no, thank you. Yep. Right. So first off, the concept of natural monopoly. A natural monopoly is an industry with extremely high capital and input costs. It's an industry with sunk costs. And of course, the national grid is an example of a natural monopoly, but so are a number of other things, including the production of oil, which is manifestly, oil and gas, which is manifestly not nationalized across the world. Now, the reason why the national grid should not be nationalized and why those alleged profits should not pass into the public domain is this. There is no proof that those profits will still be made once things pass into public hands. Now, it is true that there are empirical studies, as pointed, no thank you, that there are empirical studies which suggest that there are no changes in efficiency. But what I think those studies, as a macrocosmic overview of data, don't discuss enough are structural factors. Now, it is true that each economy has a different structure, and each economy's layout, in a way, is different. Now, Britain is said to be an economy with an advanced services sector. However, those services aren't necessarily in the line of tourism. A lot of Britain's work is in the development of the life sciences and in the development of financial technology. Those are things that unfortunately require energy. And what that leads us into is a system, yes.
So if we have to pay the public debts of these companies, so we're paying the debt of about 150, why are we not entitled to some of the profit? There seems to be a kind of logical flaw with your argument about the ethical of dividends. We already pick up their debts. So why on earth can we not profit when things go well as a nation?
Well, you're assuming that paying off those debts is a question of consent. It is not a question of consent. The fact of the matter is this. Britain is a country with a sovereign parliament. A sovereign parliament is a parliament that can make any law it likes. Tomorrow, by a bare majority of one vote in the House of Commons, using the procedure in the Parliaments Act 1911 and 1949, the UK Parliament could decree that all private property vests in the Prime Minister, and there's not a damn thing the courts or the citizens of this country could do without resorting to armed insurrection. So the idea that there is somehow this notion of public consent which backs up every single act of the state is demonstrably false. And the related, no thank you, and a related argument to that is this. Whenever the debts of companies are picked up, that is an action of the executive government. That is the action of people who have been voted to power by citizens of the UK and such persons as are empowered to vote in UK elections. So in some sense, that too is a public. If you accept the view that government is a matter of public consent, which I don't, I think it's a power relation, but if you accept that government is a matter of public consent, you have to accept that the public, whatever that notional body means, has consented to the paying off of those debts. If you're a realist and you believe that government is a power relation, you have to realize that the public has no real ability to question the exercise of power once a government is elected and once it holds on to effective executive power. If I can move on now to a related argument, and that argument is one of opportunity cost. The facts of the matter are this. There is a climate crisis, and that is something that is going to require both tremendous government expenditure and tremendous private sector expenditure if Britain wants to make out of it, get out of it unscathed. What that means is that there is an opportunity cost to every single government decision to buy something or to sell something. And when the government decides to nationalise the grid, it can do that in one of two ways. Either it can engage in coercive action. That is to say, Parliament may pass an act along the lines of this. The national grid is the property of the UK government. There will be no compensation paid to whoever owns it as of this moment, which is something that Parliament can legally do. At which point, confidence in the UK economy and financial system will collapse even further than it has now, and there will be devastating economic consequences. The second thing the government can do is this. It can buy it, at which point it will have to confront the reality that in an economy where wages have been largely stagnant except for the top of the economic pyramid, and where wages are not rising in line with productivity, and where wealth is increasingly being offshored by persons donating to the interests that hold power in today's society, governments are going to have to deal with a massive debt situation at a time where they're cutting spending on amongst other things, education and schools. And that will mean that the opportunity cost of these things is going to be in the form of public welfare. When the alternative foregone is public welfare, that's not a great situation to be in. Now, there is a solution which can exist while the grid is still unnationalized, and that solution is to extend the legal scope of judicial review, which is a procedure used to regulate administrative action, and to impose stronger duties on Ofgem and on the regulators to act in the public interest. Now, the statutory, yes?
We've changed the regulation, I think, multiple times in the last 5 years alone. All of the new form of regulations failed. When is it finally time to start admitting that something is fundamentally wrong with the system and stop trying to tweak the window dressing around it?
Well, there is something fundamentally wrong with the system, and the thing that's fundamentally wrong with the system is that we're addressing Ofgem as a body which is independent which is an independent regulator in the sense that it derives its power only from the government. What needs to be done with Ofgem is that it needs to be given independent power of its own on a statutory basis to actively and proactively intervene, to take suo motu cognizance of all sorts of issues, and to issue directions which have binding force, including serious private law sanctions, in order to extract financial remedies and impose financial costs and burdens upon private entities to a much greater extent. Give the regulator teeth. Now, the situation we have is this. You have a bunch of private companies, and you're regulating them with a watchdog over whose eyes has been tied a rather expansive wad of silk and whose teeth have been pulled out. Now, if you give the regulator slightly more power, it will work out. And the alternative to that, of course, is the straight-running things, to which I have only two names to give you, Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng. Thank you.
Thank you, Vedant. It's an excellent end to the debate. And thank you to everyone who gave a paper speech, a floor speech, a point of information. I'm very grateful. A few notices before we vote. Scholarship applications are now open. If you'd like a free and fully funded membership, please apply for a Stephen Fry or Silver Street Scholarship. These are on our Facebook and we emailed out to anyone who met us at the Freshers' Fair. Further, and equally as important, our stash order is currently open. It'll be open until Monday. It's your chance to get a Cambridge Union bucket hat, so don't miss. Tomorrow, we're in collaboration with Cambridge University for Reproductive Rights to have a panel discussion on a post-Roe America. And next week, we're debating if sex work and feminism are compatible. If you've enjoyed the debate, do get involved. Applications are open to join Sal and Max on their subcommittee planning the term ahead. A quick run through of voting. In this House, we vote with our feet. So if you are swayed by the debate and convinced we should nationalise the grid, walk through the I door on that side. If you aren't, walk through the no door. And if you're unsure and want to abstain, go through the middle. If you're upstairs, you'll be given a card to place your vote as the doors are too far apart. But thank you all for a great debate. I've really, really enjoyed it. And see you all in the bar after. If you're a union member, you get 20% off.